Alrighty, here we are, and it's time to get starched. Today I want to talk about external rotation. Everyone tends to lack external rotation when it comes to endurance sports. Especially, I know that when I was spending my time at USA Cycling, there was never a moment where I sat down and actually stretched or cared about what my hips were doing. So I lost a lot of internal and external rotation. When it comes to restoring external rotation, you're going to see the common stretches like the 90-90 or the advanced version, which would be the pigeon stretch. And while those are amazing stretches and they do produce amazing results, I found as an endurance athlete or someone who struggled with hip mobility for the longest time that those positions are incredibly hard to train out of, especially when you don't have a background in stretching or range of motion. So I'm really talking to my endurance athletes or people who just are frankly tight. Now, if you don't struggle with range of motion, you can hop into those positions and it's second nature to sit in a pigeon stretch. But remember, for most people, they're difficult positions. One of the things people say is, oh, instead of getting into a pigeon stretch, try the Figure-4. So the Figure-4 stretch would be where you lay on your back, you cross your legs, and then we do something like this. And to be honest, while the Figure-4, once again, is not a bad stretch, I found it's an awkward position that most people with tight hips hate sitting in a Figure-4, and especially they can't stay there long. So I'm going to show you a simple variation of a Figure-4 stretch, a pigeon stretch, an external rotation stretch. You can call it whatever you want, and it's amazing. Number one, because you can really adjust it based on how much hip mobility you have or don't have. You can contract really hard and build some end range strength. And I find that you can just spend a lot of time in this stretch, which is really important when it comes to actually developing range of motion over the long term. Most people, even if they have horrendous hip mobility, can get in this position. So all you need is a squat rack. You can do this in between a doorway, and it's going to look like a modified Figure-4, but instead of hugging your knee, we're going to use a squat rack. So I'm going to flip around, and I'm going to coach you guys through this. So I'm going to use the squat rack right here. And if my range of motion sucks, obviously my hips are going to be further away, so I might lift up. I can see how much active rotation I have. And that's normally a good starting point for people with bad hips. So if you go up, bring your knee over your hip, and then you actively rotate. If you have horrible hip mobility, that's a great starting place. And most people are not going to feel a stretch, but that's a good starting point. Now, when I'm here, what I can do is I can slowly take my hands and then I can scoot up with a bent leg, and then I can slowly drop that leg and start to find my stretch. Now, the cool thing about this versus the Figure-4 is I can be relaxed on the ground, which allows me a lot of time to get to know this hip and to find what lines of restriction I have versus you have. Someone might find that if they bring their heel down, they hit the spot in the outer glute. You might find if you slide your heel up, that hits the sweet spot. Now, once I'm here, I can actually use the inside of the squat rack to kind of block off my other hip so that when I'm stretching this hip, it doesn't want to run away. Another thing I can do is I can actually go away from the squat rack. So if I go away from the squat rack, I start to bring my hip into a little bit of adduction or adduction. So I can bias external rotation and adduction. You can see my knee is almost crossing my midline. So if I go crazy with that, that's almost going to be like a double pigeon pose from yoga. So the great thing is when I'm sitting here, I can just chill out. Even if I have horrendous hip mobility, I can start to just do some light pulses where I try to bring the knee away from me. And versus the Figure-4 where I'm having to maintain a little bit of active spinal flexion and actually work, now I can just focus on the hip and get the time under tension I need to create long terms. If I'm only spending 10 to 30 seconds in a hip stretch, good luck trying to actually get the hip capsule to change. So I'm here, I can start some light pulses. Obviously, when it's time to work, I'm going to be driving my foot in. So if I think actively internally rotate, so if I think about internally rotating or kicking and trying to break the squat rack, that will be my contraction to put some load on the tissues at length, which is going to be the outer hip, You're going to feel this right in the sciatic nerve area. So if you really have issues with that, we need to not simply just passively sit in a stretch. We need to develop some end range strength and capacity in the hip. Because one more time, you can sit in the stretch, you can feel a nice deep glute stretch, and then you can leave, and then you're the same person tomorrow. If you're using this to recover after a bike ride or a long run, that's awesome. So if you do this post-run or bike, that is actually a great idea, is to just sit, breathe, and relax. But a lot of you do not have hip rotation, so that means you need to change the hip. And to change stuff, you have to change. If you don't have something, you have to acquire it. And the way we acquire stuff when it comes to strength training is putting high intensity effort into tissue. So that means if water doesn't get hot enough, it doesn't boil. So once again, if you're doing this post-ride, post-run, just chill. Sit and breathe, grab 2 to 3 minutes. But if not, once we warm up, it's time to go to work, and we should be training at a high intensity. As long as it's safe, we should be above 70, 80, 90% of our max effort when it comes to that tissue. So if I'm here, I'm back in the stretch. Notice, once I'm in the stretch, I can use the squat rack to kind of pull myself in. If you were trying to do that in a figure 4 like this, you just really can't do it. So I'm here. I can change the angle, right, of my knee, so I can put myself in less knee flexion. I can put myself in more knee flexion. So many positions. I can work on a little bit of posterior pelvic tilt and hit a little different line of tissue. I can try to anterior pelvic tilt and I hit a slightly different line. So many different lines, but once again, if we don't strength train, we're not going to change biological tissue. You might get a short-term response out of the brain and get a little bit of relaxation. Once again, great post-ride, but if you're using this to change and to create range, we have to train and we have to hit intensity. So if I think about driving my heel into the squat rack, so if I try to kick the squat rack and then I try to flex my glute as hard as possible, once again, when I do that, it's going to want to push me this way so I can grab onto the squat rack. So if I grab the squat rack with this opposite hand, that can pull me in. So when I kick, it doesn't push me out, which is great. So as I kick into the squat rack, that's why you should wear shoes. Don't do this barefoot. It's going to really bug your outer heel. I'm kicking my foot in. I'm kicking my foot in. I'm putting that tissue under tension. I want to build to my safest, greatest effort. I want to treat this like a deadlift for my hip. And this hand is holding me into the stretch because as I kick, it's going to push me out. And then when it's time to get stronger on the opposing side tissue, which is going to be the deep external rotators and the adductors, I can block my knee. I can try to hold it here. And then I want to try to actively lift my foot off the squat rack and back down. I know that was hard to see. So if I lift the foot off the squat rack, there's the active range in the short side tissue, the regressive tissue. And then as I develop range, you can see you can make this as crazy as you want and get super deep into the glute. I know what you're thinking. That's so simple, but I'm not using that with myself or any of my clients. I think you're going to find that people that suck at hip mobility, which endurance athletes do, actually can train here. There's great stretches like the 90-90, the pigeon, figure 4. Those are wonderful if you have a background with range and you're not locked up. But for a lot of people, those positions are just so hard to stay in. And if you can't stay in a position for 2 to 3 minutes, you really can't work there. And if you can't work there, you can't change stuff. So I want you to use the squat rack figure 4, and I want you to mess around with it. You're going to find, holy smokes, this position is so easy to get gangster gains in. But remember, if you're doing it post-ride or post-workout, that's great. But you need to understand you have to work to change. You can't recover to change. So the intensity must be hard and high to actually change the structure of the hip capsule and the deep tissues of the hip. So that means flexing at maximum efforts that are safe to you. This is going to be your modified figure 4, and that's how we get starched.